Hard-coded credentials can be trouble, but not as much trouble as a vulnerable DevOps environment. If you want protection without the hassle of security slowing you down, CyberArk, the #1 provider in privileged access security, has the solution for you. With CyberArk Conjur, developers can easily secure secrets across any DevOps toolchain or platform, whether your application runs in the cloud or on premises. Eliminate the headaches of managing secrets and try Conjur open source for free with no strings attached. Visit conjur.org/ASW to get started today. Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences' patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW. We are here at DEF CON for Security Weekly, and we're going to be talking with Matt Alderman and myself, Paul Asadoorian, and Matt Alderman, Paul Asadoorian. We're going to talk about application security and some of the things that we saw at Black Hat. We lost track of how many briefings we did. It was more than 30. You say 30, it's more than that, dude.
Was it more than 30?
Well, I don't know. We did briefings and interviews and vendor floor.
Vendor floor. When you had the vendor floor,
side conversations.
Official briefings and recordings,
yes.
I think it's about 30.
Okay.
Out of a pool of like 100 and something.
So we're going to talk about the web AppSec vendors. So I'm going to try and scroll through my notes. Did you want to start in any particular
order place? We can start top, bottom, middle. It doesn't matter.
So we did a briefing with Synopsis.
You did, yeah.
Was that an on-air? That was an on-air recorded segment that you'll be able to watch on our YouTube channel.
Okay.
And got caught up with them. What I thought was interesting about Synopsis is they play in some of the major areas in AppSec.
Yeah.
Right. They're a large vendor with a lot of offerings. Right. They've got a dynamic tool, right?
Yep.
A static tool.
Yes.
They've got the open source library component to Black Duck with the acquisition. So they've made some strategic acquisitions to really, I think, compete with Veracode and some of the other larger players. So, and a lot of people have said nice things about Synopsis and are using them in the enterprise. I thought it was interesting that, their acquisitions have now come together into a cohesive platform. And the announcement they were making at Black Hat was IAST, right, or interactive security testing. Yeah. And really that's stringing together, right, your static, your dynamic.
It's SAS and DAS coming together, right?
Sure. So I think it's kind of a buzz term, but I like that they made strategic acquisitions. They're tying them together. Yes. I think they're one of the leaders in this category.
Yeah. So Synopsis is an interesting company. They're a semiconductor company. Mm-hmm. Traditional. That's their original core business. And a few years ago, they started snapping up application vendors. Right. Coverity, Black Duck, a couple others, and they've started to build out a pretty broad AppSec portfolio. Now they have the SAS, they have the DAS, they have all the open source composition analysis components. Yep. And, I know a few folks over there. Vatsil used to work with us over at Tenable.
Okay, yeah, is Vatsil there?
Vatsil's over at Synopsis. He's done some of these transactions. I think they've done a really good job of starting to bring different capabilities together because AppSec has always been hard. Yeah. You can't solve it just from static analysis of source code. You can't solve it just with dynamic analysis, black box testing. Now you have all the open source components. We'll talk about an open source vendor that I talked to as well that kind of competes with Black Duck a little bit on that front. But they're bringing all those pieces together and building out a cohesive application security program. There's a couple other strategic moves I think they'll have to make. As you look at runtime application self-protection, the container security space. Yep. Those are all things that I would have expect them to eventually do something about. But if you're looking for somebody who's got a broad application offering, Synopsis has it.
I agree.
So the one I talked with then kind of complementary to that was WhiteSource.
Oh, you did? Okay, you did a briefing with WhiteSource.
So I did a briefing.
We interviewed their founder on application security.
Yeah, so the co-founder who runs the North America, Ozzy Cohen, I got a briefing from him. And WhiteSource is used, they compete with Black Duck on the open source analysis.
Also, Snyk, SNYK, is another vendor, I believe, in that space. And there's other ones too that I can't think of.
But WhiteSource is a little interesting, right? Their vision was, look, 60+% of all enterprise apps have open source in them. And so they saw the problem with open source, and then they started to build out a set of capabilities really to go analyze that market. And one of the things that they're really keen on is the continuous monitoring of open source vulnerabilities. So when you do a static analysis up front, that's a point-in-time snapshot of the container image or the build at that point.
Yeah, that could be source code or binary, too, as Keith was telling me about.
Right. Now, these guys more on the binary side, but now that thing goes into production and a new vulnerability comes out, what do you do with that? You've already scanned it statically. So now, what does that mean, right? So the ability to understand that new vulnerability exists in that open source library, flag that, so that now somebody can do something about it. It might be changing a policy on the fly in production. It might require them to rebuild a container image and push it back out into production. So they're really focused on that continuous monitoring.
One of the vendors was talking about doing this open source analysis, Matt, and they had a browser plugin. I forget who it was. It might have been Synopsis. A browser plugin.
Okay.
That as your developers are searching for the open source components to use, the browser plugin is telling you that, hey, you're going to integrate this open source component, and it has these known vulnerabilities, and like flagging the system as the developers are searching for them. Talk about shifting left, or like left in the process. I thought that was really unique. I want to say that was Synopsis.
Yeah, and so WhiteSource has traditionally been an OEM player, right? So there's a number of large companies that OEM the WhiteSource capabilities.
Because I think they've got one of the largest databases, right?
They have a huge vulnerability databases, but now they're actually starting to go after the enterprise customers directly. So Ozzy coming over to build out the North America practice, they've shifted their revenue from primarily overseas now to the North American market. They're going after the enterprises directly, which I think is interesting because they have some really good capabilities. They see themselves as being able to potentially replace Black Duck as kind of the leader in that space. So it was a really good briefing on that side because it's definitely a component that has to be addressed, especially in the container world these days.
Now, we've been talking about Signal Sciences, ThreatX, and next-gen WAF.
TCell. And I also talked to TCell. Yeah, so if you want to go WAFs next, there's three of them there.
I hate the term next-gen WAF. I think it's doing themselves a disservice. And what we've established on the show, and we joke about WAFs on Paul's Security Weekly, and I want listeners to understand that when we're joking about WAFs, what we're talking about is the way Zane Lackey described it to me. He said, look, traditional WAFs are trying to put a regex in front of every every GET request coming into your web application. As we know, a lot of us in the audience, probably ourselves included, you've worked with regex before, like it's a hot mess. That strategy is a complete nightmare because of just all the different requests you're going to see.
Right.
How do you apply a regex and go, yeah, that one's bad and that one's not? Like you don't have enough intelligence.
Right, because you don't have context.
And it's the wrong technology to try and apply rules in regex to maybe back in the day.
Yeah, and at the beginning,
static web applications,
that made sense, right? When you had a static web app, it was fine.
Right. Now,
so
now
the original guys in this space were really going after the OWASP top 10.
Yeah.
Right? They were looking at the OWASP top 10, trying to protect the basics on the outside, and trying to enforce some of those rules at the web app firewall. The applications have become way more complex. There's so many other things that are happening underneath, especially as this containerization microservices build. So what I think TCell, ThreatX, and Signal Sciences are all doing is understanding that the context of what's happening in the app influences the types of rules you should or shouldn't have on the front end. And so what I saw really interesting is because I sat down with both Signal Sciences, who's a sponsor on the show. You've talked to them before. You know them really well. I'd never really dug in, so I wanted to learn that myself. And TCell is, they basically, if you look at them on paper, they're a WAF and a RASP kind of combo, right? But their approach is different. Signal Sciences is going after the WAF. They're going after the WAF budget and then showing customers that by replacing their web app firewall and bringing in some of those RASP, runtime application self-protection components, they can build a better WAF protection.
And the way Signal Sciences works, because I spent a lot of time with them, obviously, is they're basically just hooking the web server or the container or the application in some very light touch way. It's not really an agent. They're just hooking it so they gain visibility into the HTTP requests and responses. Based on that, they're taking that data into the cloud, and they're applying machine learning. And I know machine learning is a buzzword, but this is a great use case for machine learning because it's differentiating it. It's not a regex, right? They're actually doing some real intelligent machine learning to profile the application and go, yeah, that's bad. That's an attack. Or there's been this trend for, performance or whatever, and their dashboard gives you all those insights. They're more closely tied to the developer. I think where ThreatX comes in is even easier deployment. Now, Signal Sciences you can deploy in a proxy mode. ThreatX really is invested more in that reverse proxy mode because they have a background in content distribution networks and caching. You can basically use their reverse proxy, DNS or proxy or whatever, and it goes through their system. They're able to help you with performance and uptime, as well as now they're inspecting all that HTTP traffic, looking for attacks and vulnerabilities. The way I think of it, Matt, after I've done several briefings with ThreatX and Signal Sciences, if it's my internally homegrown app that I'm writing, I'm using Signal Sciences because they're a little more tightly coupled to the developer perspective. If it's an external application that has to be on the internet, has to be scalable, like in our case, we have some WordPress properties. It's easier to integrate with those external. I can host it with like our hosting WP engine. I can have ThreatX do the protection. I think that model works really well because there's some other benefits I can take advantage of. ThreatX also has kind of like a managed services team that is analyzing all those vulnerabilities for you. Whereas in the Signal Sciences model, it's more closer to your developers, and they're fixing it more left.
And so TCell is very similar in the approach to Signal Sciences, where it's that WAF RAS. Their approach, though, is different than Signal Sciences. They really try to go after the RAF's components, the runtime application self-protection, realizing that understanding what the application's doing with some of those similar type of hook concepts at the app, within the application, then influence into the WAF. So where I really see the difference between the approach TCell's taken to Signal Sciences is Signal Sciences going from the WAF to the RASP, go after the WAF budget. TCell's really going after the runtime application self-protection, but also then bringing the web app firewalling components with it so that they can also play in the WAF space, but they seem to start more at the runtime application self-protection.
And I think a big differentiator that I learned recently was in some RASP implementations, you have to recompile your app to get that level of visibility. And developers and operations people don't like that.
That's one of the challenges.
They want an easy hook. Like with Signal Sciences, it's like one line in my container, deployment, and now every time I deploy that container, it sends the HTTP traffic to Signal Sciences. They joke. They're like, if you say it takes an hour for our deployment, they're like, it's really like 15 minutes. I mean, you're in the container space, right? It's really easy when you're building a container to go, include this library, include this binary, include this hook.
Do an include.
And I think people still think of it as like an agent. And I'm like, but it's really not, though. It's just part of your application. It's more of a hook is how I think
exactly.
of it.
And again, I think T-Cell's doing something very similar from that perspective, and then tying that back in, where the original runtime application protection vendors were very language specific, you either run my agent or you code to an SDK. And as we know, that as stuff moves into the container and into container environments, the agent's not going to work. Right? So now that requires coding to the SDK. That's changing the dev process, and dev does not want to have to change their process to implement some of these security tools. And so anybody that can win the tight integration into the build process, so dev can do what it does, right? Let dev build what they do, but you can make security really easy, embedded into the workflow, and security comes along for the ride without forcing dev to change their processes. Those are the guys that win long term, because that's where that friction is going to come into play.
Did you have another one? I'm just going to go through my notes. So I have my notes on JScram because I'm really excited. This is my pick of the show. Basically, they help you protect JavaScript. And again, the two problems that they're solving are when I deploy an application that uses JavaScript, it's in the browser. Everyone can see it. But if it's my proprietary code, it's my intellectual property, I don't want people to see it, so they can obfuscate it for you in the build process, preferably before QA. And I asked them that question. I'm like, so I'm deploying my application, now you're taking my JavaScript and you're scrambling it or encoding it somehow. And I'm like, I got to test that again, right? Because what if you broke it? And they said it's a very, very low rate of actually breaking the build process when you scramble it. But then my follow-up question to them was, how easy is it to fix? And like, usually it's not that big of a bug to fix. Most people that are implementing this technology have DevOps.
Right.
They can fix it really quickly. So what I also liked is not only is it protecting your IP, when I clone the site to do a phishing attack, like let's say I'm trying to clone a Google site to capture a logon, and I'm putting it on my own site, and then I'm going to send a phishing attack, that code won't run because it's not running on Google's site. So they've scrambled it in such a way that it ties it to specific things from Google and helps prevent against phishing attacks. I think those are two great problems that they solve at a great price point. They've got a lot of like anti-debugging. So when the other thing I hadn't mentioned yet was that if you take that scrambled code and you're trying to debug it and run it through a debugger, it actually crashes the attacker's debugger. Oh, so they've got some anti-tampering stuff built in, which I think is really awesome. So in the company side, I was also impressed. So like, to get the A for the day, you got to impress me on all fronts. Yeah. Not only was their team enthusiastic, super nice people, very, very smart, very accepting of talking with me, and I was like high-fiving them. I'm like, you guys are doing awesome. So they got a Series A of $3 million. They're selling the product today. They priced it on number of apps, number of protections, and they were the first to market. They've got some competition starting entering the space, but I think where they're positioned as a company is just fantastic.
It's great.
So, my A for the day.
Yes, it was your A for the day. I have two more buckets. I'll save the container security interview last.
Sure.
Then I had two kind of overlapping ones again, right? Arxan and Erdetto. Mm-hmm. And these are companies that kind of started out more on kind of the digital rights, protection of gaming systems and other things, and now moving their technologies into protecting code. Mm-hmm. So they're doing some binary injection capabilities to obfuscate code, to protect the code. So as attackers are trying to attack it, they can change up the way the code works and runs to protect it. I did a live cast with the Erdetto folks, so that will be available for people to view to kind of get an overview of what Erdetto is doing. Arxan very similar though, so I see these two kind of in this competing space, really going after some of this code obfuscation for these new apps, containers, and in the other code. So an interesting space, right, is how do you protect the source code from attackers and the ability to change that code around in production, on the fly, on the endpoint, right, on the mobile device or on the IoT device or in the industrial IoT environment. I thought that was really interesting technology. A couple guys I'd never really talked to before and understood their space, so it was a really interesting conversation. Kind of similar, but something for people to definitely take a look at as they're taking code and deploying it on endpoints, and then wondering how do I protect that code on that endpoint? Because attackers are going after it. It's a little different than you running it on your own environment. So think of it as all these kind of endpoint applications that are running that may not have communication back to you to really protect. Are there these types of techniques or potential ways to protect it?
Awesome.
Any more on your side? I had one more.
Go ahead. I think that's it on my side.
Yeah, so the last one I met with was Sysdig on the container security front.
Okay.
And I think most people would think of Sysdig more on the container monitoring side, but they've actually built a security product. And Sysdig's interesting because a couple of the Layered Insight competitors were using the Sysdig kernel, the open source Sysdig kernel, to build their application. Well, now Sysdig has a security solution. So I met with Apurva Deve, who's a chief marketing officer, but really technical. So I took the interview because I really wanted to understand kind of the vision. And the vision from day one was not just to build a container monitoring tool, it was to build a container security tool.
Right.
And I think what was interesting is, they use a kernel plugin approach. I think they will, we talked a lot about how are they going to address things like Fargate and Azure container instances. I think there's some technology stuff that they're going to have to do there. But right now they're not getting requested to move into those environments. And so when you run dedicated infrastructure or infrastructure as a service in the cloud, if you want to load kernel plugins, this solution has its pros and its cons. But they're definitely going after the security space. Black Hat was the first time they'd been to a security conference.
Yeah.
Because they've really marketed in DockerCon and Container World and a lot of the places I would show up at Layered Insight.
Right.
They show up at Black Hat, and I said, I want to understand. So they're definitely going to be a competitor of ours coming into the space.
Oh, so they're not just doing scanning of the containers, but also a full-blown runtime security monitoring solution.
Yeah, exactly.
Runtime protection, I think, is better.
Runtime protection, yeah. Exactly right. So it was interesting to talk to them, and I just eyes wide open for me on my side now. But it was he was very candid, and it was a great session. And I know a lot of people are using Sysdig for base monitoring, but they're going to continue to build out the security product.
Awesome. I think that rounds out the web app security side of what Matt and I covered at Black Hat. So that will conclude this segment.
Thank you for watching this interview from Las Vegas. If you want to watch and learn more, go to securityweekly.com/summercamp18 or go to our YouTube channel Security Weekly to view the playlist.